One Last Run by Jason Cackley of the Ear Implant Foundation, Senior Recreation Coordinator. I woke up sweating, out of a nightmare of fire, of molten buildings, and screams of desperation and shock. I saw a city that looked engulfed by a hyperspeed volcano and also wrecked into embers by a falling meteor. In the dream, I couldn't discern the cause of the trauma. All I knew in the dream was that the city had been burned to ashes, and all hope for future better times had been incinerated. As the nightmare continued, I saw rivers of molten glass, molten metal, melted concrete, and burning skeletons floating in a fiery sludge. I then saw a bird's-eye view of misery spread out in a terrifying panorama. The earth was wrapped in a typhoon of unholy damnation, inflicted by burning miniature suns coming down from the sky. Their plasma shells erupted, hotter than the surface of the sun, blowing out winds orders of magnitude more ferocious than the most intense hurricane, before contracting and sucking everything back into a radioactive bonfire that turned civilization into molten rubble. I woke up in a hot sweat, even though it was barely above 65 degrees in my room. I was under just a minimum of covers and jogging pants and an old shirt. I threw off the little covering that I had and got up and rummaged around for a fan. It was late January in Colorado, but I felt like everything was burning hot, as if the inferno from my dream had spread into my waking life. I had a feeling of suspicion and a nagging in my gut. Something didn't feel right, something besides my apocalyptic dream. I took a sip of water from the bottle next to my bed. I looked at the clock and it said 4 a.m. I had more time to sleep before my alarm clock was set to go off for work, but I didn't think I could have dozed back off, even if I wanted to. I got up, took a piss, and decided to brush my teeth. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw that my face was red. Sweat dripped down from my forehead. I felt like something bad must have happened, but I had no idea what or to whom. I thought that maybe someone close to me had gotten into a car accident, or maybe a fire, or maybe a volcano went off somewhere, or maybe a meteor hit somewhere, something like Tunguska, or maybe a solar flare. But my electricity still worked, and my phone still worked. I opened my phone and checked for any missed calls or text. I had no new contact notifications, so I opened a news app and saw a disturbing headline in red letters. Nuclear attack confirmed in Zurich. More details to come soon. No country has yet claimed responsibility. I scrolled down and confirmed that a nuke, most likely hidden inside a truck bed or a train car, had gone off in Zurich, Switzerland, a neutral country. No one could explain how this could have happened, other than a small, portable nuclear device had been detonated from a concealed place. There had been no incoming missiles spotted. The blast had come from the ground in the middle of the city, with no forewarning from the sky. No country or terrorist organization anywhere in the world had yet taken responsibility. There were no clues as to who may have been behind the attack. There was no confirmation about any retaliatory strike being planned, nuclear or otherwise. Since it was unknown who was responsible, no one had any idea about who they would counter-strike against. No one even had any idea about who would have a motive to nuke Switzerland. All I could see from the news report on my phone and on TV now were that global tensions were beyond tense. Aerial footage showed the flaming wreckage of what once had been Zurich. It looked like the inferno from my dream. In front of the Swiss Alps, there was a miasma of flaming and molten debris, the size of what once had been a major metro area. The view from an aerial drone cam revealed a scene that looked like a pit of molten magma had sprung out of the ground in the middle of the city, with fires raging all around the central lava pool. The estimated death toll at the time was 1 million, with many more expected to be counted in that grim total in the days to come. I ate a protein bar and thought about whether or not I should go into work that day. I thought maybe there could be some better use of my time in case this thing were to escalate into, the nuclear end of the world, and these might be my final hours on Earth in this body. I turned the TV off and put my phone down. I looked around and saw my snowboard and gear in my closet, and then I looked down at the scram device on my ankle. I had a DUI a few months ago. The judge told me to either wear this thing or go to jail. I wasn't supposed to drink a single drop of alcohol or leave Jefferson County, and the scram device on my ankle made sure of it. Also, my driver's license was suspended. However, on that day, I thought that somehow a broken scram may not be a top law enforcement priority on a day when a nuke had exploded. I grabbed my snowboard, coat, boots, gear packs, goggles, and helmet, went outside and loaded up my Jeep. Before taking off, I went back into the kitchen and made a protein shake mixed with cold brew coffee. I filled up a grocery sack full of trail mix jerky and dried fruit on my way out, along with some bottled protein shakes and protein bars to keep in reserve. I filled up another grocery sack with canned soup and a can opener. I grabbed a case of water while I was at it, and also an envelope full of cash. I had no idea how long I would be able to survive up in the mountains in case Denver got nuked, and I had to survive up in the high country. That's granted I survived the blast. I had only a layman's understanding of nuclear weaponry. I was not sure if the blast wave of a nuke blowing up over Denver could make it all the way up into the high country. I guess a lot of it would depend on what altitude the nuke was detonated from. The higher up the blast, the worse it would be at higher altitude. Still, being in the mountains seemed like a better survival strategy than staying in Denver, which would likely be a target if this situation were to fully escalate. After packing up my Jeep, in the frosty Colorado winter morning air, I backed out of the driveway just right before sunrise. I drove illegally out of the snow-lined streets of my neighborhood in Lakewood, in the west suburbs of Denver, and headed out on Highway 6 west towards the mountains. Ahead of me, a line of traffic was forming, making its way towards higher ground. It was an unusual amount of traffic to be headed west on a Tuesday morning. I speculated that at least some of the traffic was heading towards doomsday shelters in the mountains. It was also likely that there were other people out there like me, out for one last run. I drove out of Lakewood with my scram still wrapped around my ankle and my suspended license in my wallet. I didn't want to trigger an arrest warrant by taking it off before I even got to the foothills. I felt sure that the police would have greater priorities on a day like today. Still, I thought it would be best to keep the scram on until I was out of the county. I wasn't sure if a removed scram in Jefferson County would trigger a warrant in the next county over in Clear Creek, but I thought of this as the best strategy for buying me time to get higher up in the mountains before becoming a target of law enforcement. I didn't want to risk having to face the dawn of nuclear Armageddon in jail, getting my rectum rocked before getting vaporized, a bad way to go. I drove west on Highway 6 and exited off onto I-70 to the mountains. I drove through Golden and Jefferson County, where my probation for DUI was being administered. I cringed as I drove past the glass-domed Jefferson County Courthouse, where I had recently stood in front of a judge, a condescending asshole. I won't lie, it was a cut-and-dry case. I was hammered the night it happened. It's not surprising that I ended up driving the wrong way on a one-way street that night. But now here I was, taking a risk, passing the Jeffco Hall of Doom, with the thought of the end of civilization in the back of my mind, and the thought of shredding through powder in the front of my mind, and the knowledge that I was breaking probation all around. I could see the sprawl of the Denver metro area, down below me and behind me, taking on the first shine of the sun, rising over the flatlands in the east. I looked back at the half-lit sprawl of the mile-high city through my rearview mirror, possibly for the last time. I could see a whole lot of traffic headed towards the airport. I took this as confirmation of the rumor I had heard about the airport concealing a huge underground nuclear shelter. I passed the last outskirts of the metro area and drove through the gap in between the hills that stood as a gateway between the world of the city and the alpine wilderness further west. My Jeep's engine revved as I pushed my foot harder on the gas as the road began its ascent towards higher altitude. The highway began winding its way through the surrounding foothills that were covered in a thick blanket of snow from the recent storm that had dumped buckets before dissipating into a dusting over the city below. I felt the familiar shift in my brain that always occurred on that particular stretch of road. It felt as if I was leaving behind the suffocating reality of the urban world with its laws, demands, and congestion, and I was on my way to enter an elevated and more natural realm, like I was becoming fully conscious out of a state of delirium. As I drove through the upward sloping curves, I found myself stuck behind a semi-truck that was struggling and moving slow. I had intended to stay in the slow right lane to play it safe, but as I slowly followed behind the truck, I felt like a clock was ticking inside my head. I looked through the rearview mirror and made a quick turn into the passing lane. I slammed on the gas as hard as I could to get ahead of the truck. As soon as I pulled back out in front of it, I looked at my speedometer and saw I was 10 miles an hour over the limit. To my horror, I saw a highway patrol car parked along the side of the road up ahead. I slowed down as fast as I could without looking obvious. After passing the highway patrol car, I felt a sinking feeling and looked back in my rearview mirror, expecting to see flashing lights and my damnation behind me. Luckily, the patrol car stayed put as I carefully made my way through the next curve in the road. Once the paranoia passed, my mind shifted back into the energized peace of the mountain journey. The road climbed steadily past the Genesee Park exit. Then the view to the west opened up as the incline leveled out, and the frosted expanse of the larger mountains in the distance became visible. The otherworldly view of the rising sun reflecting off the distant peaks became more apparent as the highway went into a downhill section after running under the bridge leading to the Buffalo Herd scenic overlook. The pine-covered foothills soon blocked the view of the more distant mountains as the downward slope leveled out before ascending once again after the Floyd Hill exit. Once the road began moving upwards again, I noticed a sign announcing the Clear Creek County line on the side of the road to my right. This was my signal that I was out of Jefferson County, and it was time to free my ankle from the scram that was shackled around it. I pulled over to the side of the road and went back to get my toolbox out of the back of my Jeep. I remembered a story someone had told in my DUI class about how they got arrested after taking their scram off because they wanted to have a beer and watch a Broncos game. Someone else in class asked how he did it, but the teacher told him not to give anyone any ideas. Later, when the teacher wasn't around in the break room, I overheard the conversation detailing how the removal was done. I played the conversation back in my head as I fumbled around with my needle-nose pliers, electrician scissors, and a screwdriver. I apprehensively looked out the window and in the rearview mirror, half expecting a whole SWAT team to show up at any second. My heart pounded in my chest and sweat dripped into my eyes before I finally detached the dystopian device. Once it was finally off, I set it in front of my front tire. I heard a satisfying crunch as I rolled forward. I merged back into traffic from the side of the highway. As I continued my journey, I felt a mix of relief and paranoia. I felt I had taken a weight off myself, but at the same time, I felt like I had put a target on my back. I kept moving west, knowing that I had just triggered an arrest warrant for myself. I had an inner vision of an alarm bell going off in my probation officer's office down in Golden as he picked up the phone to call out a statewide, all-points bulletin for my detainment. My thoughts of being swarmed by patrol cars soon dissipated as I crested the incline and the view of the western peaks opened back up again. The view of the snow-capped mountains brought me back to the mission at hand to get in one last run. My plan was to first stop at Loveland Ski Area, one of the closest ski areas to Denver, normally a drive of a little over an hour from my house. I hoped they would have the lifts open so I could just pull off of the highway to get one last run in. But if the lifts weren't open, I would have to find an alternative. One option would be to park at the bottom of Loveland Pass, the road leading to the Continental Divide. I would hitchhike my way up to the top of the pass where I would drop in. The other alternative would be to drive to the top of the pass. After shredding down from the Continental Divide, I would then hitchhike back up to the top to get my Jeep and drive back down. And the highway took a sheer drop down, past the Black Hawk exit, then leveled back out as it went past the Central City exit. I saw people pulling off at both exits. I wondered if they were on their way to the casinos in those two towns, with plans to spend their last hours in front of a slot machine. These thoughts led me to thinking about the end coming soon. I also thought about how Denver was probably in chaos now, with people rushing to the grocery stores in a panic-buying spree. As disturbing as these thoughts were, they served as a reminder that the police probably had their hands full, and me taking my scram off and driving with a suspended license would probably not be a top priority as people woke up to the apocalyptic news causing mass hysteria. I remembered in school, when we studied the Cold War, and they brought some nuclear preparedness specialist guy in to talk about the government plans in case of a nuclear war. He said that a full-on nuclear holocaust could burn the whole surface of the Earth in a few hours after the first detection of a nuclear launch. So, if Zurich had been hit with a missile, instead of something like a bomb concealed in a truck trailer or a train car, I probably wouldn't have had enough time to get up into the mountains. This must be a special case, since the bomb had been planted in a discreet location somewhere inside Zurich and exploded from inside the city. There had been no detection of a missile launch to trigger atomic Armageddon, and no one knew who was responsible. So I figured the case should best remain a mystery, at least until I found a good spot on the slope to get my boots strapped into my bindings. My feeling of dread faded away as I passed through the Veterans Memorial Tunnel and began cruising down towards Idaho Springs. For a moment I felt like the spirits of nature who inhabited the surrounding alpine summits were standing guard against any misfortune. Then, as I approached the Idaho Springs city limits, I made a bad decision and turned on the radio. As soon as I turned it on, I wanted to turn it off, but couldn't, like a reluctant stare at a car crash, except in this case, an oncoming world crash. Though I had bad reception in the mountains, I managed to tune into a news bulletin, and I heard President What's-His-Name giving a nationwide address. From what I heard, before he was interrupted with static, was, "This time of crisis, we must all remain pragmatic. The ramifications of a nuclear exchange can never be understated, and no possibility of political gain can be worth the risk of provoking a wider attack. As of now, all the best minds of all the world's best intelligence agencies are trying to find out who is behind this attack that has changed the course of our world's history forever. My fellow Americans," static cut off President What's-His-Name's speech in mid-sentence. I turned the dial to get a better signal, but gave up when I realized I didn't need to hear any more. At least I knew no more nukes had gone off, at least not yet, and they still didn't know who done it. Still, even without the bad news from the radio, feelings of concern returned as I drove through Idaho Springs and saw long lines at all the gas stations in the small town. I looked at my gas gauge and saw I was over half empty. I would have enough gas to make it up to the top of Loveland Pass, but getting back would be an issue if all the gas along I-70 was sold out. That was given that the world wasn't engulfed in fire before I even had a chance to run on empty. As I passed out of Idaho Springs, I tried to combat the sinking feeling of everything about to come to an end by reminiscing about my previous adventures in the mountains. I remembered my first snowboarding trip with my brother when I drove up from Kansas City when he was in college in Boulder. I thought about how excited I had been at first when I began my first snowboarding lesson at Eldora ski area, how discouraged I had been midway through after dozens of falls, but how by the end of the lesson I was ready to move to Colorado. 6 months later, I moved to Denver, right before my brother found a job outside of Seattle, leaving me to find my way in the mile-high city on my own. I remembered my first time boarding alone, with neither an instructor nor my brother to guide me up at Loveland ski area when it was under 20 degrees below zero, not including the gnarly wind chill. I drove home that day feeling like I had been run over by a truck in a flash freezer, but I still wanted nothing more in the world than to come back the next weekend and do it again. Soon after Idaho Springs, I passed through Downingville and drove past the shop where I had bought my first board. I remembered walking into the shop hungover, a can of Red Bull in my hand. I had been determined to get up to Arapahoe Basin ski area, locally known as A Basin, before close that day and get in a few runs on my own board instead of a rental. I remembered the previous week before that, when I rented a board and drove it with me up over Loveland Pass and down to A Basin. On the way back, I got stuck in a traffic deadlock at the top of Loveland Pass after a surprise blizzard moved in. The blizzard raged on as I made my way back down I-70 after an hour delay and a piss into an empty water bottle. The shop was closed, so I couldn't return my board. I left a note with my phone number on the door. I didn't want to leave the board outside to get stolen, so I took it with me. When they called me on Monday morning and told me how much it would cost per day to keep it any longer, I called in sick to work and took the day off to drive the board back up there. Then I came back the next Saturday and bought my first board. These memories now seem bittersweet as I passed out of Downingville, on my way to what could probably be my last run. But hopefully not. I thought hopefully maybe I would get to drive on this road to the slopes again. Maybe whoever set off the nuke would remain a mystery. Maybe by the time they found out, tempers will have cooled down enough to take the idea of going full nuclear off our world leaders' minds. Maybe. Hopefully. But then again, I had just taken my scram off and crushed it on the side of the road. So the bad news for me, in the best case scenario for everyone else, where everyone just decides to chill and not destroy the world, would still involve police cars waiting for me when I got home. So at that point, I made up my mind to try to stay up in the mountains as long as I could, nukes or no nukes. I had packed up for a few days. I had taken about $1,000 in cash in case credit cards became useless. Then I passed through Georgetown and saw more lines at the gas pumps. I realized that even if another nuke didn't go off, I would likely end up getting stuck up in the mountains with no gas to get back. Oh well, I thought. I've always thought about living off the grid, but never had the balls to do it in real life, except for that one weekend I tried but got poison ivy. I would have to use this as an opportunity to take the plunge into an off-grid lifestyle. Granted, I didn't get arrested over my scram removal first, or die in nuclear fallout first. As soon as I got done snowboarding, I would have to find an abandoned shack somewhere off the beaten path, find some way of starting a fire, and live off the provisions I had brought with me until I could think of a better plan. As I drove out of Georgetown, heading up further in altitude, with the mountains towering above the highway on all sides, I made another bad decision and decided to see what kind of news I could get on my phone. Not that I really wanted to know, but I just had to look. I fumbled with my phone screen as I drove with one hand on the wheel. I managed to pull up a news clip. Secretary What's-Her-Name with the whatever government department was giving a speech about how a massive investigation was underway. All details were classified. Then I heard an interruption for more breaking news. Retaliatory protocol is being reconsidered in this case, but intelligence agencies are narrowing down the search for who may be responsible for this horrendous event. My better judgment took over, and I turned the video off and set my phone aside. Then I picked it back up again, flicked through my notifications, and saw that I had missed calls from my mom, brother, and soon-to-be ex-girlfriend. As I cautiously drove behind a semi-truck on a winding section of the highway, I flicked on a text. It was from my girlfriend, Pam, whom I had been secretly planning on breaking up with. "Where are you? We need to get to Alamosa now." I remembered Pam talking about her family's shelter one time when we got stoned together and somehow got on the topic of doomsday prepping. Her dad worked for Lockheed Martin down in Littleton. He claimed to be privy to secret information channels that could advise him on when it would be a good time to make a dash to his nuclear bunker. The bunker was strategically located near Alamosa in the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado, a sparsely populated area surrounded by mountains on all sides and a relatively safe distance from the major metro areas of the Front Range. I had doubts about if his sources had anticipated such a black swan event as what had happened today. It would be about a 5-hour drive from Denver to the shelter, so as things were unfolding today, it seemed unlikely that they would actually reach their bunker in time. Then I thought about what it would be like to live in that doomsday shelter for however long, with the girl I was thinking about breaking up with, and her dad that asshole. It probably would be better to just get nuked and get it over with. I thought for a second about calling my mom and brother back. Not that there was anything I could do for them, or that they could do for me. They both lived in separate states. I thought about maybe just calling to say goodbye, but then I would get all teary-eyed and scared of nuclear winter, and have all that floating in the back of my head during what may be my last run. I decided to turn my phone completely off. I wondered for a moment about what my friends might be doing. Were they panicking? Or just trying to go about their day like usual? Or trying to search online for their nearest fallout shelter? Or glued to the TV in a state of terror? Or out panic buying in a riot? Or praying, maybe at church? Or just hitting the bong to some Marley and hoping for the best? I took a deep breath to get my mind into tunnel vision, like I was about to drop into a black diamond slope. I set the intention in my mind to maintain black diamond focus, straight ahead tunnel vision for the rest of the trip. I needed to somehow pretend that this was a normal trip up into the mountains, and this was a normal day, and I wasn't about to either die in a nuclear war or end up in jail either over my broken scram or for driving with a suspended license. I drove past the tiny town of Silver Plume, which consisted of only a few blocks and some scattered houses and trailers on the outskirts. I thought about my recent trip there back in the summer. I stayed at the bed and breakfast and went hiking on mushrooms on the trail that starts on the edge of town. I did the hike alone. While hiking up the switchbacks, the mushrooms induced a revelation that I should break up with Pam, probably sometime soon. I got the message from the sky that day. Too bad I'd only waited until now to take the sky's advice. After passing Silver Plume, in my memories of that psychedelic summer day, I got locked back into black diamond focus. I was approaching the final stretch, towards the exit off of I-70 and onto Highway 6 West, the Loveland Pass Highway, the path to glory, into a realm where I had experienced some of the proudest moments of my life. But I could not get stuck in reminiscence. I had one last run to get in. The traffic slowed down to a stop-and-go pace as I drew near to the exit right before the Eisenhower Tunnel that ran through the divide. The loss of momentum made me feel agitated. However, driving at a slower speed allowed me to get a good look at the lofty peaks of the Continental Divide up ahead of me. The traffic loosened up a bit as I approached the exit. I felt the familiar butterflies in my stomach that I felt every time I exited off of I-70 and onto Loveland Pass. That highway exit ramp had etched itself in my mind as being a pathway to either adventure, misadventure, or both. Today I hoped especially for adventure only. The good kind, not the learn from this experience kind. I didn't have time for that today. I drove under the I-70 bridge, around the corner to the right, and then cruised along the stretch of road leading to Loveland Ski Area. The entrance to the ski area's parking lot was blocked off by a highway patrol car with its lights flashing. Near the lift entrance, I saw a group of law enforcement officers confronting a group of skiers and snowboarders. The police were guarding the lift house. Apparently, others had had a similar idea as me, except they had taken it one step further and broke into the lift house to start the chairs themselves. Luckily, I didn't get here sooner and get myself involved. It would have been bad for my probation situation. I kept moving ahead, around the first bend in the pass, past the flashing highway patrol lights, with my paranoia creeping back up on me. Then I looked at the snow piled up on the sides of the road, and my mind returned to the mission at hand. I thought over two different options about how to proceed. One possibility would be to drive to the top of the pass, board back down to the highway, and then hitchhike back up to the top so I could get back to my Jeep and drive back down. I decided against this, as I would be taking the risk of not being able to find a ride back up to get my Jeep after my descent. This felt especially chancy, with the police presence in the area. After ruling this first option out, I decided it would be best to park down below and then try to thumb for a ride to the top. I could stand next to my Jeep while I waited for a ride, and in case of an approaching law enforcement vehicle, I could pretend I had just gotten out to take pictures and then get back in my Jeep and avoid any kind of legal entanglement. I found a good place to pull over, then took a moment to get my gear together. Once geared up, I stood out on the side of the road with my thumb up. An icy cold gust blew down on me from the mountains above. The sun was shining, though clouds were forming. The weather on the Continental Divide could change in a matter of minutes. I hadn't checked the forecast that morning, so I wasn't sure what I was in for. As I stood with my thumb out on the snow-packed side of the road, a few cars passed by without slowing down at all. One of the cars drove by with a guy yelling at me from the passenger side window, "It's the end of the world." Finally, a car slowed down and pulled over. A rugged-looking dude with dreadlocks dressed in tie-dye colored snow gear pulled over and signaled for me to get in. I opened the passenger side door, and a cloud of cannabis smoke flew out at my face like a cloud of steam out of a hot oven. I got in despite my usual fear of a second-hand positive drug test. I was already in too deep for that to matter now. "Dude, you going to the top, man?" the driver asked. "Yeah," I said, "to the top, for one last run." He handed me his joint and said, "Come on, man, don't talk about the last of anything. Just take a puff of this and pretend this is a normal day. Look, let me be straight with you, man. I just took 10 hits of acid. I'm willing to give you a ride, but if you fuck up my vibe even just a little, I'm kicking you out. Now hit that joint and just space out on this scenery and think about that pow-pow." I almost had the joint to my mouth, but then I reflexively said, as I had been recently well trained to say, "Sorry, man, I'd like to, but I'm on probation." He said back, "Ah, shit, man, just puff that thing. Fuck probation, especially today, a normal day. Normal except for the laser lines in the sky and the buffalo running around up on the mountains." I looked around and saw no bison running around anywhere on the mountains. I decided to go ahead and say, "Fuck probation," and took a hit off the joint. As I puffed, he said, "Man, you were really on thin ice with my vibe-killing policy." "Sorry," I said as I exhaled. "No need to be sorry, man. Just good vibes, man," he said. "Yeah, good vibes," I said back. I tried handing the joint back to him, but he waved back to me and said, "Nah, you keep that. I need to keep my hands on the wheel and my eyes out on the road for more buffalo." I took another toke off the joint and looked around, hoping to see at least one buffalo, but hopefully not in the middle of the road, either in real life or in the driver's head. As the cannabinoid wave crept up on me, the driver said, "My name's Starmer. Some people just call me Star Chaser, or Star for short, but only my closest. You can call me Starmer for now." I asked Starmer, "So where do you plan on dropping in?" He replied in an enthusiastic tirade, "Dude, I'm going all out today. Man, I'm about to strap in and shred straight into the abyss of the universal mysteries. That's what I'm about to do. I'm going to aim my board at the edge of the black hole of infinity with all the buffalo and the alien laser lights in the sky. I'm going to ride that mountain straight into the cosmic underbelly. How about you?" I replied, "I'm going to hike up the divide from the parking area at the top of Loveland Pass and just find a good spot to dive into along the ridge." Starmer said, "Oh, come on, man. That's basic bitch shit. That's as basic as those bros who were trying to break into the Loveland Lift House down there. Man, I'm going up the east way, and I'm going to shred right down into the gully between Grizzly Peaks and Torrey's. Do you want to come with me?" I took a puff off the joint and thought for a second. I thought about how long it would take to hike all the way up to Grizzly Peak, a rough hike even in summer, and decided against it. I also thought about how long I actually had left on Earth, or how much time any of us had left. "How do you plan on getting out of the gully?" I asked Starmer. he replied. Maybe I don't plan on getting out. Why not try, I asked. He snapped back. I will, man, I will, but fuck, you're starting to fuck up my vibe a little right now. You mean to say you're not coming with me? No, I'm okay if you just drop me off at the parking area at the top of the pass. He finally said, Man, that's it. Sorry, dude, but I'll have to throw you out. You're killing my vibe. I'm dead set on dropping down from Grizzlies, and if you aren't on board, then you're just killing my vibe, and this is a good vibe day. I'm going to have to kick you out now. You'll probably be able to find another ride soon. And watch out for the buffalo. As he pulled over to the side of the road, he said to me, I wish you the best of luck, man. And remember, good vibes. Good vibes, I whispered as he pulled away. I sarcastically waved back at him as he made his way around the next turn in the pass. I stood on the side of the road, a few 100 feet in elevation short of tree line. I stood next to a wall of plowed snow that was taller than me and put my thumb back up. I felt another blast of icy mountain wind, much colder this time than further down below. The air was colder up here but crisper. I took a deep breath and felt instantly refreshed from the smell of nearly pure frost mixed with a dash of pine. A family in a minivan with a look of panic on their faces drove by. They were followed by another car full of college-age kids who also looked panicked. Finally, another Jeep, just like mine except white and covered in dirt stains, pulled over. The driver motioned for me to get in. Did you just sled down to this part of the pass on accident? He asked. I replied, No, I had another ride but decided to get out. He was giving me bad vibes. Yeah, I hear you, man, the driver said. Can't blame him. It's a bad vibe kind of day, but we're here. We then passed above tree line, onto the snow-capped roof of the continent. Yeah, we're here, I said. Probably the best place to be right now. For sure, he said. As we crested the summit of the pass and slowed down to pull into a parking area at 11,990 feet above sea level, I said to the driver, I'm just going to hike on the west ridge from here. That's the same place I'm going, the driver said. Cool. That other guy wanted to go all the way up to Grizzlies. No way, the driver said. Right. We probably don't have that much time. Probably not. That other guy was on 10 hits of acid. I'm not killing your vibe or anything, am I? No, man. I know I just gotta stay in Black Diamond focus. Me too, Black Diamond focus, I replied. Damn, 10 hits of acid? The driver asked back. Yeah, he said he was seeing buffalo. Well, I hope he stays safe. And I hope he has a good ride. I hope we all have a good ride. I nodded in agreement as we got out. We then both got geared up as quickly as we could. My driver introduced himself as Mitch. As we carried our boards and walked along the highway towards some other skiers and boarders who were making their way towards the trail leading to the Continental Divide Ridge, Mitch said, I just woke up in the middle of the night for no reason and decided to turn the TV on. As soon as I turned it on and saw the news, I knew I had to get packed up and make it up here as soon as I could. I said, yeah, I woke up after a nightmare of seeing the world on fire. There was a sudden awkward silence. Seemingly in an effort to quickly change the subject, Mitch said, Have you ever ridden backcountry? I said to Mitch, No, I usually just go to A-Basin or Loveland and sometimes Keystone or Breck, and maybe Vail once or twice a year. Mitch said, Yeah, it's been a long time since I've ridden backcountry. In fact, it's been a long time since I've ridden at all. About 2 years. I exclaimed. Damn, it's been just 3 months for me and I've been fiending for a run. What kept you? Mitch asked in return. I explained. I got a DUI. Mitch asked, How'd you do that? I sighed and confessed. I drove the wrong way down a one-way street in Golden. Mitch shook his head and said, A rite of passage for many. Did you have to wear an ankle monitor? I laughed and said, Yeah, but I took it off and drove over it after crossing the Jeffco County line. Mitch said back jokingly, Well, I doubt there'd be any cops up this far up on the mountain, so you could probably at least make it down the slope without getting arrested. We walked towards the stairs that led to the west trail. Next to the trail was a sign that read, "Warning, backcountry users. Avalanche blasting at any time using long-range weaponry." As I passed the sign and made my way up the stairs, I hoped there would be no danger of avalanches or long-range weaponry, nuclear or otherwise. After trudging up the stairs, we walked up the west trail towards the divide. A blast of Arctic wind swept down. Clouds of icy dust drifted in the air around us. We could see clouds forming over the peaks overlooking A Basin. Clouds were forming in the sky above us, moving fast as they expanded. The weather was changing quickly, as it often tended to do above tree line. As the sunlight dimmed, the air got colder, and the wind got stronger. A few boarders walking ahead of us decided to go ahead and drop in. Mitch and I gave them a salute and cheered them on as they made their way down the slope. After watching them slide down, we continued our march up along the trail, towards the ridge along the divide. Mitch said, "I haven't hit the slopes in a while. A little divorce situation had me tied down to the flatland. I had to make an exception for today." I nodded in agreement and said, "I had to make an exception for today, too. If we don't actually get nuked today, I'm going to have to go to jail for breaking my scram and breaking probation." Mitch said, "Yeah, well, as bad as that sounds, let's just go on and not think of nukes and just hope that some way, somehow, everything just works out. And remember Black Diamond focus. And remember good vibes." "Yeah, good vibes," I echoed back. We trudged up the snow-packed trail with our boards in hand. Though we were hiking slow, we were both breathing like we were jogging. Despite the chilly air, I felt sweat running down my face. Normally, I would stop to shed a layer, as sweat and freezing air are a bad combination, but any thought of slowing down now was answered by the sound of a ticking clock inside my head. After a challenging hike, we soon made it up to the ridge. Once on top of the ridge, an expansive view to the west opened up before us. We could see a little bit of Keystone in the distance, but Breckenridge and A Basin were obscured in a snow fog. Alpine forest spread out below us for miles all around, running over rolling hills and up steep peaks. Through the gaps in between the snow cloud curtains, we could see glowing white peaks an unknown distance away, with glaring reflections of the few rays of sunlight still filtering down through clear patches between the clouds. Snow flurries came down at us as we stared down at the sprawling view below. A sudden influx of clouds swooped in and blocked our view of the scenery in the distance. The intense, high-altitude sunlight was soon obstructed by rapidly forming pockets of snowfall, now merging together into a single storm, intensifying with gusts of Arctic wind. To our north, snow swirled in whirlwinds on the trail running over the ridge ahead of us. As we continued along the ridge, Mitch pulled out a flask and took a sip. He then handed the flask to me. "Here, drink to probation," he said to me. I took a sip and was overwhelmed by the taste, but not in a bad way. As I shuddered a little, Mitch said, "Nothing like a little cast-string bourbon out on the mountain. Can't argue with 120 proof." We passed the flask back and forth a few times, until Mitch finally waved it away. He dug into the pocket of his snow pants, then set his board down and squatted down on the ground. As I took another sip of the strong liquor, Mitch proceeded to light a joint with his hood pulled all the way over his head and his hands cupped just right. As soon as he got out from underneath his improvised joint lighting tent with his joint lit, the wind died down, but the snow started coming down like a curtain. After Mitch exhaled his second hit of the joint, he handed it to me and asked, "So do you know if this weather here is about to turn into something big?" I replied, "No, not me. I haven't really paid much attention to the mountain weather since I've been on probation. Yeah, I just hope we're not in any avalanche danger. Still, all things considered, that probably wouldn't be the worst way to go." "Yeah," I said, "probably better than other ways," as I intentionally repressed any further thoughts about what was going on down below. Mitch said, while motioning for me to move ahead with him, "Yeah, well, come on. Let's walk further up along the ridge and find a place to drop in." We stayed close to each other and handed the flask and the joint back and forth as we walked along the ridge with the snow coming down. The flakes got bigger and more powdery as the wind tapered off. Our visibility was soon limited, but luckily it was a straightforward route along the Continental Divide ridgeline with no real navigation skills required. As we walked along, the snow beneath our boots was powdery and not icy, and with more fresh snow falling down, this was a good sign of a good run. It was Tuesday, so the terrain looked fairly fresh, better than it would have been on a weekend day. We walked about a half mile along the ridge until we found a spot to drop in with a minimal amount of previous disturbance to the snow. Mitch said in a huffing and puffing voice, "Man, I really don't want to walk too much further up here. There may be better places up ahead. I can't tell with the limited visibility now, but this looks like as good of a place as any. I think I'll drop in here." I honestly didn't feel like walking any further myself, so I also decided this was good enough. It wasn't exactly fresh powder, but close enough, with the fresh snow falling down around us. After sitting down and getting my front foot strapped into the bindings on my board, Mitch handed me his flask. I took another sip as he strapped his own front foot into its binding and then used his coat as a mini-tent to relight his joint. He got it lit, took a couple puffs, and then handed it to me, and I handed him his flask back. He took a big long sip out of the flask, and I took a big long hit off the joint until I started coughing. We were up at about 12,500 feet above sea level, in a land that cared little for the doings of man, or any other living creature, including plants. Moss grew up here in summertime, with maybe some patches of grass and some alpine flowers. However, most of the year, snow and ice coated this forbidden land. This was the snow-capped roof of the entire continent. We handed the flask and the joint back and forth, determined to finish each one before we absolutely had to get moving downwards. Around the time the flask was a few drops from the bottom, and the joint was burning close to our fingertips, Mitch stood up. I stood up along with him. "You think we'll be able to get 2 runs in today?" he asked. "That'd be nice," I said. "Hopefully this run lands close to my Jeep. I honestly have no idea where I'm going." "Me neither," Mitch said. I replied, "Same here. I've never boarded in the backcountry before. I mostly stuck to groomed resort slopes, like a basic bro. But I still had some good times back before probation." Mitch asked, "How are you with tree runs?" "I've survived before, at Keystone. I took the Snowcat ride out once." "That's better than anything I've done recently," Mitch said. We stood in silence for a moment, listening to the alpine wind whisper through the pine trees below. I felt high enough from the joint and the flask to hear voices in the wind. During an interval between wind gusts, Mitch blew out a breath of whiskey-soaked weed smoke and asked me, "Have you ever heard of the Tibetan Book of the Dead?" "No, I've seen it on bookshelves before and flipped through it a little, but I've never actually read it before." Mitch explained, "It says that your last thoughts before death translate over into your Bardo experience." "What's a Bardo experience?" I asked. He explained, "The Tibetans, who live up in the Himalayan mountains, a lot higher up than we are now, say that the last thought that you have when you die makes an impression on your experience of the intermediary states in between incarnations." I thought this over for a moment and said, "Yeah, that makes sense. With that way of looking at the afterlife, it would make sense to just stay in a state of black diamond focus. Then you can just shred your way through that Bardo place and come out on the other side on your own terms." "Yeah," he said, even though I haven't actually done any real black diamond runs in a while. "I've done a few," I said. Mitch said with a grudging tone in his voice, "Better than what I've been doing lately. Mostly running through a bunch of divorce paperwork." "Yeah, that sucks. So, about the Tibetans, they say your last thoughts translate into the after-death world before you reincarnate again?" Mitch answered, "Yeah, so I guess you want to try to think the right thoughts before you die so your next incarnation is easier. Of course, none of this has been scientifically proven, but it makes the most sense to me." I asked him, "What if this world gets blown up and we don't have anywhere else to reincarnate back to, only a nuclear wasteland? Mitch thought for a moment and speculated. I guess you could always try to find some way in the bardo to delay reincarnation 1,000 years after society builds back. And in your next incarnation, you'd have to figure out how to reconstruct the lost art of snowboarding. Either that or try to reincarnate somewhere else in the galaxy, somewhere similar to Earth, with a place like Colorado somehow. Yeah, that sounds like the best idea, I replied. I looked down to stare at my feet, with the weed and whiskey washing over me. Fresh snow was building up on the ground and covering my boots. I sat down and strapped my back foot in to get ready to roll. Then I saw a flash of light bursting through the air. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. "Get down," Mitch yelled. We both got low to the ground, with our heads down and eyes covered. A blast of gale-force wind blew around us. An eruption of bright orange and yellow reflected off of the snow, visible even with our arms shielding our ski goggles over our eyes. "Keep your head down and your eyes covered," Mitch yelled through the wind. I was already doing so. A roar trembled through the air and echoed all around us. The ground shook beneath us. This was immediately followed by the rumble of hidden avalanche pockets giving way down the sides of the surrounding mountains. Luckily, we were on top of the ridge, and there was no snow above us that could topple down and bury us. We knew then that something nuclear had happened, and it was best to stay plastered to the ground until the wind died down. The wind wailed on at a gale pitch for over a minute, and then gradually died down. We both cautiously looked up and around us. Up above, we could see the sky had been cleared of its previous snow clouds, but now there was a red glare in the sky. I heard Mitch say, "Oh my God, they took out the springs to the south of us. Looks like they wanted to take NORAD out down there before taking out Denver. We still have some time, but we better make it quick." I looked to the south and saw a cloud of fire shaped like a mushroom in the direction of Pikes Peak, Colorado Springs, and NORAD. The mushroom cloud was over 100 miles away, but the sight of it inspired a feeling of apocalyptic terror. I felt like I could be sucked up into it from a distance. It was as if a fiery chasm had opened in the fabric of our space-time continuum, and the whole world was being vacuumed up into it. This was it, I thought. The world had reached the point of no return. I looked back to the east and saw that Denver had so far been spared, at least for now. Still, we knew then our time was probably short, as we stared in mystified and terrified awe of the fiery cloud piercing its way up into the sky, billowing out in all directions up in the atmosphere. "Come on, let's roll." Mitch handed me both the flask and the remains of the joint and stood up on his board. "Think good thoughts for the bardo," he said, and swung his board forwards and started moving down the slope. I took one last pull off the flask, one more hit out the joint, and then threw them both aside and dropped in for what I knew now was my last run. Mitch had already carved out his own path down and to the right of me. I let him have his space, so I cut to the left. The red nuclear glow in the sky reflected off of the snow, giving the white powder a tint of blood. I kept my focus away from the sky and towards the sloping ground below. As I slid along, I tried to imagine that the sanguine hue radiating off of the snow was due to a special tint in my ski goggles. I didn't have time to think about this for long, as I saw I was heading straight for a patch of rocks. Seeing there was no way to go but straight down, I quickly turned my board away from the rocks and back towards the open slope. After a few quick turns, I saw an untracked heap of powder and cut straight down. I kept going straight until I felt my testicles jump up in my throat. Then I carved out a few zigzags to taper off into a manageable speed. Once under control, I sped back up, going mostly straight with a few subtle turns. My momentum generated an icy wind that I could feel in my teeth. As the steepness of the slope decreased, the snow got deeper as I moved down. The snow ahead of me looked knee-deep. I felt the depth of the deep powder I was heading into drag my speed down. I leaned my weight backwards, then felt myself cruising on top of the powder. I made a quick turn and shot a spray of snow up in the air. As I glided across the open area, I cruised in a straight line, building up speed until I was shredding through the snow, the fastest I'd ever boarded in my life. Exhilaration pulsed through every cell in my body. I was in the zone. It felt like time no longer existed. The red glow in the sky and its crimson reflection off the snow seemed perfectly natural, like nothing was wrong at all. I continued speeding along as I approached the bottom section of the run covered in trees. The first trees I encountered on the way down were baby pines, some standing out individually, others in clusters. I looked ahead and saw an opening through the larger pines, with clusters of baby trees standing in front of it. I weaved around the first few clusters, then saw that the gap in between the next clusters ahead of me had a steep bump. I had never gotten good at doing jumps on my board. Part of me wanted to try to skid to a halt before coming to the bump, but I knew in the back of my mind that this was a now or never moment. I took a deep breath and tapped into my earlier confidence built up from achieving record speed. In the last few inches before hitting the bump, my heart jumped up into my throat. Soon I was airborne. I flew 3 feet into the air, feeling weightless for a fraction of a second. As I fixed my eyes on my anticipated landing spot, the feeling of suspension in air was replaced with a jolt through my feet, ankles, and knees. I felt myself stumble after landing. I braced myself for a face full of snow and maybe an injury. My focus turned into a laser beam directed at the trees ahead. This brought my balance to a center. To my pleasant surprise, I stabilized out of the stumble and kept gliding forwards. Once stabilized, I focused on my next obstacle, the pathway through the trees. I had enough room to make a few turns to slow down. Then I turned forward straight as an arrow. The trees surrounding the gap looked menacing. I turned my focus back into a laser beam and pointed straight down the middle of the gap. I held my breath as I went in between the trees. I was relieved to find that behind the trees was a wider path ahead. I kept moving in a straight line and built up speed again. Up ahead was another bump. With my swagger boosted from my previous successful landing, I steered straight towards the bump. As I got closer, I saw it was even bigger than the previous one. I was also going even faster this time. However, this time I was ready for it. I flew straight over the bump and launched at least 5 feet up in the air. Time felt suspended as I glided over the ground. I landed as smooth as butter and continued moving ahead at maximum speed. I found myself going down a path with both sides sloped like a half-pipe ramp. I zigzagged from one side to the other, cutting straight down each embankment, propelling me back to the record speed I had achieved earlier. I moved along the trail at a speed that I would have normally thought of as reckless. I whizzed past the trees and the sound of my board cutting through the snow intensified. I was so caught up in the moment that I didn't realize that I was heading straight towards the highway until I heard the sound of an engine. I looked ahead and saw the asphalt in between the final section of trees ahead. On the right side, there was a place to turn into a level path that ran adjacent to the highway where one could come to a smooth stop. I leaned in this direction, but then I saw another path on the left out of the corner of my eye. I saw the path led to a steep drop into a snow ramp. I saw there was yellow caution tape that had been cut down on the ground next to the path entrance. The blood-colored snow was a reminder that I had nothing else to lose. Without slowing down, I sped straight over the yellow tape on the ground. I zoomed straight down the steep drop, then up onto the ramp. Before I had time to question my own judgment, I was flying through the air like an eagle with the highway below me. As I soared, I looked straight ahead at the landing spot on the other side of the road. If there would have been a vehicle coming at me while I was airborne, I wouldn't have known. I was so focused on the other side of the highway that I felt like I could see each individual particle of snow where I was headed. Everything moved in slow motion as I moved out of the peak of my jump and started moving down. As I moved further out and further down, I felt like my landing spot was a magnet that was pulling me towards it. I felt my feet touch the ground and a huge splash of powder flew up into the air over my head. Time moved out of slow mode as I stabilized myself and slid down through an opening through some trees into an open area around a creek bed. With my senses heightened to a superhuman level, I tore through the open section, maintaining steady momentum. I glided over the untouched powder below me, moving through it as if I was on a wakeboard on a lake, feeling like I was floating on water and not even touching the ground anymore. Up ahead, there was a section of scattered trees and a fork in the path. I slowed down to skate around the trees and cut left. I flew through a narrow opening into a wider area. I saw the path ahead narrowed again, so I skidded into a modest pace. Soon the path narrowed into what looked like a dead end. I was about to come to a stop, but then saw an opening that looked wide enough for me to fit through, but just barely. I carefully slid through the opening, scraping my left glove on the tree. I then found myself in a section of tight trees. I gritted my teeth as I slowly navigated around them. I came out of a turn around one tree, then saw I was headed straight into another one. I jerked my board around as fast as I could without tipping over. I felt the side of my board scrape against the bark. After narrowly dodging around tree after tree, I soon found an exit. The opening led to a groomed slope with only a slight incline. I slid down the slope like I was taking a victory lap. I raised my fist in the air and let out a yelp of triumph that echoed up into the mountains above. The slope flattened out, and I could see that I had crossed over into Loveland Valley, down the road from the main Loveland ski area. I slid forward on the flat ground until I drifted into a stop. I took a deep breath, partially in disbelief of what I had just done. I sat in the red glowing snow and undid my bindings. After unstrapping, I reached into my backpack to get some water. Then a flash lit up the sky from the east. This flash was much brighter than the earlier one. I immediately put my hands over my eyes. I could see the bones of my hands like an x-ray through my ski goggles and closed eyelids. Soon after the flash, I heard a deafening roar, moving quickly in my direction. A burst of wind, saturated with snow, flew straight into me. I could tell it was coming from the east, from the direction of Denver, or what once had been Denver. The wind knocked me flat on my back. From my back, through my glared eyesight, I saw the expanding mushroom cap of the nuclear explosion that had just vaporized the Denver metro area. Then I felt the ground shaking around me and felt like I was being pushed backwards. I slid across the ground, then up into the air. I soon saw that I was flying in the air towards the trees. I braced for impact, but then I saw that I was up above the trees and flying higher. Other trees were flying in the air with me. The current of air pushed me higher up, all the way above the ridge of the Continental Divide. I flew higher and higher, way above the highest peaks, all the way up into the atmosphere. I lost consciousness from asphyxiation up in the sky as I was propelled by the nuclear wind blast into oxygenless unconsciousness. My last thoughts were, that was an awesome last run. Hopefully I will be able to get another one like that in, even in another life, even on another planet, in another timeline, in another galaxy. I'm glad that I got one last run in. Hopefully I will be able to get another one in somehow in my next incarnation. I'm thankful for Mitch, wherever he is, for giving me a ride up the mountain and hanging with me for my last moments on Earth. May we meet in the next life. I hope Starmer's okay. The end. This has been a presentation of One Last Run from the Ear Implant Foundation. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe on this platform. The text version of this story is available on the Ear Implant Foundation page on Substack. Also on Substack, check out our other stories, The Surveillance Van, The Virtual Haunted House, and The Ear Implant. Also, feel free to pledge your support for the Ear Implant Foundation on Buy Me a Coffee. Now go out there and get in one last run before the world ends in nuclear hellfire. And remember, good vibes. And get your ear implant.